My name is Hannah Lawson, and if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that family can be your biggest cheerleaders, or your harshest critics. In my case, it often felt like the latter. I've always been the different one, the one who didn't follow the expected path, the one who didn't tick the neat little boxes my parents seemed to value so much. My older sister, Leah, was the golden child, straight-A student, star athlete, predictable in the best way. She went to the right schools, joined the right clubs, married the right kind of man. My younger brother, Ben, was the adventurous one who somehow always landed on his feet no matter what. Then there was me, Hannah, the middle child who people said had potential but never seemed to apply herself in the ways they wanted. The truth is, my life never followed a straight line. I took jobs that interested me, not necessarily the ones that looked impressive on paper. I traveled when I could, took classes that intrigued me even if they didn't lead to a degree, and spent years working in areas most of my family didn't even understand. And because I wasn't constantly broadcasting my achievements, they assumed there weren't any. I didn't correct them. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe I just got tired of feeling like I was constantly on trial at every holiday dinner. The last few years had been especially hard. My mom would drop little comments like, "Hannah, when are you going to settle into something stable?" My dad, meaning well but missing the mark, would ask if I'd considered going back to school. Ben would tease me, sometimes lightheartedly, sometimes not, about how I was still figuring things out. And Leah, well, Leah never said anything directly. She didn't have to. Her perfect, shiny life did the talking for her. So when Leah called to tell me she was hosting a big dinner to introduce the family to her fiancé's colleagues, I almost said no. She was marrying a man named David, a career military officer. From the little I knew, he was respected, well-connected, and surrounded by people who lived and breathed discipline, hierarchy, and achievement. Not exactly my crowd. I imagined sitting at a long table full of strangers in crisp uniforms, everyone talking about ranks and deployments while I tried to smile politely and not feel like a complete outsider. But Leah was insistent. "It would mean a lot to me if you came," she said over the phone. "You've barely gotten to know David, and his friends are basically like family to him." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I told myself I could handle one evening of polite conversation. I even bought a new dress, nothing too flashy, just something that made me feel put together. The restaurant Leah picked was one of those upscale places where the lighting is low, the waiters glide around like they're on wheels, and every plate looks like a piece of art. When I walked in, I saw her immediately. She looked stunning, her hair swept up, her smile radiant as she stood next to David, who was in his dress uniform. I felt a little flutter of pride for her. Whatever else, she'd found someone who clearly adored her. She waved me over and introduced me to David's friends and colleagues, men and women who carried themselves with that unmistakable military bearing. Some were in uniform, some in suits, but all of them had the same alert, confident presence. I shook hands, smiled, made small talk. Most of them were polite but a little reserved, which I didn't mind. And then it happened. David's commanding officer, a tall, silver-haired man with a voice that seemed to fill the room, arrived with his wife. Leah and David greeted them warmly, and then Leah turned to me. "This is my sister," she said brightly. "Well, technically my older sister, but she's kind of our family's free spirit." Then, with a laugh that didn't quite feel warm, she added, We always say Hannah's like our weird cousin who disappears for months and comes back with stories from who knows where. The words hit me harder than I expected. I forced a smile, but inside, something twisted. Weird cousin. Disappears. Who knows where. I could tell she meant it as a joke, but in that moment, in front of strangers, it felt like she was reducing my entire life to a punchline. I noticed a few polite chuckles around the table, but the commanding officer's expression shifted ever so slightly. His eyes narrowed, and he asked, "Hannah, what's your last name?" I hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Lawson," I said. For a heartbeat, he just looked at me. Then his brows shot up. "Lawson? As in General Robert Lawson?" The table went quiet. Every set of eyes turned toward me. "Yes," I said slowly. "He's my grandfather." The commanding officer actually straightened, his entire demeanor changing. "Ma'am," he said, and I swear I saw David's jaw drop. "I served under your grandfather early in my career." The man was a legend. His leadership, his integrity, he shaped the way I lead to this day. Suddenly, the tone at the table shifted. People leaned in, asking me questions, not just about my grandfather, but about me. What I did. Where I'd been. What I'd worked on. I could feel Leah watching me, her smile just a little tighter than before. I didn't launch into a speech or start listing accomplishments. I just answered honestly, letting little details slip, details I'd never shared with my family. About the years I'd spent working on international aid projects. About the time I'd been embedded with a humanitarian team in a conflict zone. About the advisory role I'd taken on for a security consultancy that had quietly become a major player in international negotiations. It was like pulling back a curtain, just a little. And the reactions. I saw David's friends looking at me differently. Respectfully. Curiously. Leah's fiancé glanced at her, then back at me, like he was seeing me for the first time. By the time dessert arrived, the commanding officer was telling stories about my grandfather, and people were toasting to the Lawson legacy. Leah barely spoke for the rest of the evening. I drove home that night with a strange mix of emotions swirling in my chest. Part of me was still stung by her comment, still wishing she'd introduced me differently. But another part felt like maybe, finally, the truth about who I was, and what I'd done, was starting to surface. What I didn't know then was that this dinner was just the beginning. Because the moment that man called me ma'am, it set off a chain of events in my family that would change everything. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was upset, though Leah's comment still sat like a small stone in my stomach, but because my mind kept replaying the look on the commanding officer's face when he recognized my name. It had been genuine surprise, followed by that crisp respect I'd seen exchanged between soldiers my whole life whenever they talked about my grandfather. It made me think about him. About summers at his house when I was a kid, running around barefoot while he sat on the porch, never raising his voice but somehow always in command of everything around him. He had a way of looking at you that made you want to be better. When I was older, we'd talk for hours about the world, about leadership, about the responsibility that comes with power, about how integrity means doing the right thing when no one is watching. I never told my family much about those conversations, because they were mine. Private. Sacred. But the next morning, I woke up to a message from Leah. No good morning, no how are you. Just. What was that last night? I stared at the screen. I could practically hear the edge in her voice through the text. What do you mean? I typed back. She replied almost instantly. You barely say anything about your life for years, and then you drop all that in front of David's friends? You made it sound like you're some kind of, I don't even know, spy? Consultant? Whatever it was, everyone was looking at you like you're this big deal. I considered my response. I could have explained that nothing I said was new, it just happened to be the first time she'd heard it. But instead, I typed, I was just answering their questions. Her reply came slower this time. Well, you made me look stupid. That stung. Not because it was true, but because it revealed exactly what she was feeling. This wasn't about me exaggerating or lying. This was about her being uncomfortable that I didn't fit neatly into the underachiever box she'd built for me in her head. I didn't respond. Over the next few days, though, things got interesting. First, David sent me a message on social media. A simple, polite, "It was great meeting you. I'd love to hear more about your work sometime." Then two of his colleagues, people I'd barely spoken to at the dinner, connected with me on LinkedIn. And then, out of the blue, I got a call from the commanding officer himself. "Hannah," he said warmly. "I've been thinking about our conversation. I know you're not in the military, but the work you've been involved in, well, there's a joint civilian-military symposium next month. You'd be a valuable voice there. Would you be interested in attending?" I almost dropped the phone. Yes, absolutely," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. He gave me the details, told me he'd send an official invite, and that was that. I hung up, my heart pounding. This was huge, not just professionally, but personally. It felt like an acknowledgement from someone who understood the weight of what I'd done. Of course, when Leah found out, because of course she did, her reaction was predictable. "So now you're going to be on stage with military officers?" "At some big conference," she said when she called me, her voice tight. "Do you even have the credentials for that?" I wanted to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so typical. Leah had spent years not caring about my work, dismissing it as vague and unimportant, and now that other people were taking it seriously, suddenly she was concerned about credentials. But here's the thing, I didn't need her approval. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't seeking it. When the day of the symposium came, I wore a simple black dress and a small silver pin my grandfather had given me before he passed. It wasn't military issue, but it was his, and wearing it felt like carrying a piece of him with me. The event was everything I'd expected and more, rows of neatly pressed uniforms, sharp eyes, and conversations that cut straight to the point. I was part of a panel discussing the challenges of coordinating humanitarian aid in active conflict zones. The other speakers were senior officers and policy experts, and yet, they treated me like an equal. They listened. They asked questions. They took notes. Afterward, several people came up to thank me for my perspective. One young officer said, "Ma'am, what you said about local trust building, that's something we overlook way too often." I drove home that evening feeling a strange mix of pride and disbelief. This wasn't just about proving myself to anyone else, it was about realizing I'd been underestimating my own work, too. But my family? They still didn't know what to do with it. My mom tried to be supportive, though I could tell she didn't quite understand what I'd done. My dad, to his credit, seemed impressed, though he didn't say much. Ben thought it was cool but kept joking about whether I was secretly in the CIA. And Leah, well, Leah avoided talking about it entirely. At least until the next family gathering. It was my mom's birthday, and we'd all agreed to meet at her house for dinner. I arrived a little early to help set up, only to find Leah already there with David. They were in the kitchen, whispering, and when I walked in, they both stopped talking. The meal started off normally enough, cake in the fridge, presents on the side table, small talk about work and the weather. But then, out of nowhere, Leah leaned back in her chair, fixed her eyes on me, and said, "So, Hannah, how's your military career going?" Her tone dripped with sarcasm, and the room went silent. I could have fired back. I could have told her exactly how petty she sounded. But instead, I smiled and said, "Busy. Rewarding." And I'd been invited to consult on a cross-agency project next quarter. David glanced at her, and I caught the flicker of something in his expression, admiration, maybe, or curiosity. That was the moment I realized Leah wasn't just uncomfortable. She felt threatened. And that was going to make things very, very interesting. The thing about family tension is, it doesn't stay quiet for long. You can try to keep things polite, you can smile through gritted teeth, but eventually, the cracks show. Over the next few weeks after Mom's birthday, Leah made it her personal mission to chip away at my composure. It was subtle at first, little digs slipped into conversations, half jokes about me rubbing shoulders with generals, comments about how I must have a lot of free time if I could go to events like that symposium. I let it roll off my back. Mostly. But then she started bringing it up in front of other people. We were at a small barbecue at Ben's house one Saturday. It was just family, plus a couple of Ben's friends and neighbors. I was sitting with one of them, an older woman who worked in logistics, when Leah joined the conversation. "Hannah's basically famous now," she said with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "She's been giving speeches to military big shots. Next thing you know, she'll be getting medals." The woman looked intrigued. "Really? That's impressive. What's your field?" Before I could answer, Leah jumped in again. "It's complicated. You'd need a lot of time to explain it. She's not technically in the military. She just works around it. Or something." I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice calm. "I work with cross-border crisis response teams," I said. "Sometimes that involves military coordination, but I'm not enlisted." The woman nodded, clearly understanding, and Leah quickly changed the subject. But that moment stuck with me, not because she'd tried to undermine me, but because I could see the effort in her face. It wasn't a casual remark. It was deliberate. I thought maybe she'd ease up after that, but instead, she doubled down. A week later, I got a group text from her, me, Mom, Ben, and Dad, linking to an article about inflated job titles in the corporate world. Underneath, she wrote, "Reminded me of someone winking face." I stared at the screen, my hands curling into fists. I could have ignored it. I could have deleted it. But instead, I typed, "You should be careful throwing stones, Leah. You might hit something fragile." She didn't reply. Things came to a head 2 weeks later. It was Dad's retirement celebration. He'd been at his company for 38 years, and they were throwing a formal dinner in his honor. He'd invited the whole family, plus a lot of his colleagues, some of whom had known me since I was a kid. I decided to go, partly to support him, partly because, well, I wanted to see what would happen. The venue was a hotel ballroom, softly lit, with round tables dressed in white linens. There were speeches, a buffet, and a slideshow of Dad's career highlights. Leah arrived with David, looking perfect in a sleek navy dress. She gave me a polite nod, nothing more. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd keep things civil for Dad's sake. I was wrong. Halfway through the evening, I was chatting with one of Dad's old friends, a man named Richard who now worked in government operations. We were talking about a recent flood relief effort I'd helped coordinate when Leah appeared at my elbow. "Hannah," she said sweetly, "you should tell Richard about the time the general recognized you at dinner. Or was it a colonel? I can't keep track of your stories." Her tone was light, but the words were sharpened just enough for me to hear the intent. Richard, however, didn't miss a beat. "Oh, I know about that," he said, smiling. "In fact, I was going to ask if you'd be interested in speaking at a regional planning summit next spring. We could use someone with your experience." Leah's smile faltered. I met Richard's gaze and said, "I'd be honored." "Thank you." That was the last straw. Later, after the speeches, I stepped outside for some air. The night was cool, the hum of traffic in the distance. I heard footsteps behind me, and Leah's voice. "What are you doing?" she demanded. I turned to face her. "Enjoying the evening. Supporting Dad." "You." She crossed her arms. "You know what I mean. You've been parading around, making yourself look important. Dropping hints about your work so people will ask questions. It's..." "Leah," I interrupted, my voice steady, "you've been taking shots at me for months. You've twisted my words, undermined me in front of people, even in front of strangers. And for what? Because you don't like that other people take me seriously?" Her eyes flashed. "You act like you're above everyone. Like you're the only one doing anything worthwhile." "That's not true," I said quietly. "But I'm not going to apologize for the life I've built. I've worked for every opportunity one have. If you feel small next to that, that's not my problem." For a moment, she looked like she might say something else. But then she just turned and walked away. Inside, the evening carried on as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had shifted. Leah wasn't going to let this go. And neither was I, because for the first time, I was done letting her define me. I didn't realize it yet, but the next family gathering was going to make everything explode. The strange thing about family tensions is that they simmer quietly, until something boils over without warning. After Dad's retirement dinner, things between Leah and me were icy. She didn't speak to me directly unless she had to, and even then, it was clipped and formal. I thought maybe she'd keep her distance for a while, but I should have known better. It wasn't even a month later when Mom announced that she wanted to have a big Sunday dinner. "Everyone," she said over the phone, "it's been too long since we've all sat around the table. No excuses." I could hear the cheerfulness in her voice, but also the determination. When Mom wanted something, it usually happened. I agreed, partly because I didn't want to disappoint her, partly because, Well, a tiny part of me wanted to see where this would go. When I arrived that Sunday, the dining room smelled like roasted chicken and fresh bread. Mom had gone all out, candles, her best plates, even cloth napkins. Dad was in the living room chatting with Ben, and Leah was already at the table, scrolling on her phone. "Hey," I said, sliding into the chair across from her. She gave me a short nod without looking up. Dinner started out calm enough. We passed the bread basket, poured glasses of wine, talked about the weather and Dad's plans for his new fishing hobby. But it didn't take long for the conversation to turn. "So," Leah said suddenly, her tone light but her eyes fixed on me, "how's life as a, what was it again? International operations something?" I set down my fork. "Crisis response coordinator," I said evenly. Right, she said with a little laugh. "Must be nice, traveling around and telling people what to do." I imagine it's more administrative than anything, though. Ben shot her a look. "Leah." "No, it's fine," I cut in, smiling tightly. "It's a mix of both. Some of it's on the ground, some of it's strategic planning. Depends on the situation." She said, taking a sip of wine. "It's just, when people hear crisis response, they probably think you're running into burning buildings or something. Not sitting in meetings." Dad cleared his throat. "Leah, maybe we can talk about something else." But she wasn't done. "I just think it's important to be clear about what we actually do. Titles can sound a lot fancier than the job really is." The room went quiet. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but before I could respond, there was a knock at the front door. Mom got up to answer it, and a moment later, she walked back in with a tall man in a crisp uniform. He looked to be in his late 50s, with sharp eyes and an air of authority. "Everyone," Mom said, "this is Colonel James Parker. He's here to drop off something for your father, but I told him he had to come in and say hello." The Colonel shook hands with Dad, then glanced around the table. His gaze landed on me, and something shifted in his expression. "Well, I'll be," he said, walking toward me. "Hannah Matthews?" I stood, startled. "Yes, sir." He smiled broadly and extended his hand. "We've never met in person, but I've read your reports. Your coordination during the coastal flood last year was exceptional. You saved us weeks of work." For a moment, the room felt utterly still. Leah's fork froze halfway to her mouth. "Thank you," I said, shaking his hand. "It was a team effort." "Modest, too," he said with a chuckle. Then he turned to the table. "You all should know, this woman is the reason we were able to get supplies into the Northern District before the second wave of storms hit. Without her, the situation would have been a lot worse." I could feel everyone's eyes on me. Ben looked impressed. Dad looked proud. Leah looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. The Colonel stayed for a few more minutes, chatting about Dad's retirement and a charity event coming up. But before he left, he said, "Hannah, I hope you'll consider joining our strategic advisory panel next quarter. We could use someone with your expertise." "I'd be honored," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. When the door closed behind him, there was a long silence. "Well," Ben said finally, "that was something." Leah set down her glass a little too hard. "I'm just saying, it's easy to look good when you have the right connections." Dad's tone was sharp now. "Leah, that man didn't say those things because of connections. He said them because your sister earned it." "I didn't say anything. I didn't have to." The look on Leah's face told me she'd heard it loud and clear. Dinner continued, but the mood had shifted. Every so often, I caught Leah glancing at me, her expression tight. I realized then that it wasn't just jealousy. It was something deeper, something about the fact that she couldn't control the way others saw me. And I knew this wasn't the end. If anything, it was just the beginning. After that dinner with Colonel Parker's unexpected praise, I thought maybe Leah would back off for a while. But I clearly underestimated her. A few days later, I got a group text from Mom. "Don't forget, this Saturday is Ben and Leah's engagement party. Dress nice, everyone." I hesitated before typing back "I'll be there." To be honest, I wasn't looking forward to it. Not because I didn't want to celebrate my brother. Ben has always been good to me, but because I knew Leah would use the event as her stage. She loved being the center of attention, and I had a gut feeling that after the way the Colonel had made her look small in front of everyone, she'd be itching for payback. Saturday came faster than I wanted. The party was held at a beautiful rooftop venue downtown, complete with fairy lights strung overhead and a live acoustic guitarist in the corner. Leah was in her element, floating from table to table in a sleek silver dress, hugging guests, laughing just a bit too loudly. Ben greeted me warmly. "You made it. Glad you're here, Hannah." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, hugging him back. For the first hour, everything was surprisingly pleasant. I chatted with a few family friends, caught up with some of Ben's old college buddies, and even managed to enjoy a plate of the little spinach pastries Leah had ordered. But just as I was starting to relax, I heard it. From across the room, Leah's voice rang out, "Oh, you haven't heard about Hannah's job? You're going to love this." I froze. The group she was speaking to included Leah's maid of honor, her parents, and a few people I didn't recognize, probably colleagues or family friends. Apparently, Leah continued with a smirk, she's some sort of crisis response coordinator. Which sounds intense, right? Like she's rushing into disaster zones, saving the day. But actually, she leaned in conspiratorially, it's more of a desk job. Lots of emails and meetings. A few polite chuckles rippled through the group. I felt my stomach knot. I could have ignored it, walked away, but then I remembered the look on Dad's face at dinner when the Colonel had spoken about me. The pride. The relief. And I thought, no. Not this time. I walked over, calm but purposeful. "Leah," I said evenly, "do you mind if I clarify?" She turned, feigning surprise. "Oh. Hannah, of course. Go ahead." I smiled at the group. "Yes, I do work in crisis response. That means sometimes I'm coordinating from a command center, and sometimes I'm in the field. For example, during last year's coastal flooding, I was embedded with a military unit for 8 weeks straight, ensuring aid distribution reached isolated areas before the second wave of storms hit." Leah let out a small laugh. "Well, sure, but that's not every day." "No," I said, meeting her gaze, "because disasters don't happen every day. But when they do, we have hours, sometimes minutes, to act. And the difference between sitting in a meeting and being in the field is, sometimes nothing at all. The calls I make in those boring meetings decide which areas get evacuation orders first, which hospitals get supply drops, and which families are rescued before it's too late. The group had gone silent. Leah's maid of honor looked awkward. One of the unfamiliar men, a tall guy in his 40s, spoke up. "Wait, are you Hannah Matthews? The one from the Southeast Flood Task Force?" I blinked. "Yes, that's me." His eyes widened. "I read your report on the logistics gridlock issue. You're the reason we were able to get the railway supply line running in under 48 hours. Leah's smirk faltered. The man extended his hand. "John Patel, Department of Emergency Management. It's an honor to meet you in person." I shook his hand, smiling faintly. "Likewise." Before I could say more, another voice chimed in from behind me. "Hannah Matthews?" I turned to see a woman in her 50s, dressed elegantly, standing with two other guests. "My husband has mentioned you many times. He says you're one of the sharpest crisis managers he's ever worked with. He's in the military, so that's saying something." The air around the group shifted completely. Where there had been mild amusement at Leah's little dig, now there was curiosity, respect, even admiration. Leah's cheeks flushed, and for once, she didn't seem to have a comeback. She mumbled something about needing to check on the caterer and slipped away. I spent the next 20 minutes answering questions about my work, not in a boastful way, but just explaining what I did and why it mattered. People were genuinely interested. I realized then that it wasn't about proving myself to Leah. It was about reminding myself that my work was meaningful, no matter how someone else tried to diminish it. Later that night, as the party wound down, Ben came up to me. "Hey," he said quietly, "I don't know what Leah's deal is with you, but I'm sorry. She shouldn't have done that." I shrugged. "It's fine. I'm used to it." "Well, you shouldn't have to be," he said firmly. We hugged, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe my brother and I were on the same side again. Still, as I left the rooftop and walked toward my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that Leah wasn't done. People like her rarely let things go, they just regroup and try again. And deep down, I knew she was going to make her next move bigger and riskier.